All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about the political spectrum. You may or may not have heard this term before, but I'm sure you are familiar with the concepts. If you've ever heard anyone say, that they are left wing or right wing, or that they are conservative or liberal, really what they're referring to is the political spectrum. And so we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about what the political spectrum is so that we can get a sense of what all this left wing, conservative, all those things actually mean. And then really that will help us better understand what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican or a Libertarian or any of those other things. So let's get started. So first, what is the political spectrum? Well, really, the political spectrum is an admittedly oversimplified way of deciding of measuring a person against all of the other people that have political opinions. And they end up finding themselves on this line, really, because the political spectrum is sort of like a line. And they find themselves on sort of the left side of the line or the right side of the line based on how they feel about, major political issues. And all citizens and all politicians fall somewhere on that line depending on what they believe. Everybody that has a brain and has an opinion about anything ultimately would fall on this imaginary line. Whether it's somewhere in the center or leftish or rightish or very far or whatever, everyone has a place on this line based on how they feel about some of the major issues. So to see where you stand, really, you would have to kind of figure out what you feel about some pretty major things. So how do you feel about social issues? How do you feel about things related to the people's ability to choose marriage partners or their ability to choose assisted suicide? How do you feel about those things? How do you feel about economic stuff? How do you feel about taxes? How do you feel about health care? How do you feel about retirement plans? But also, how do you feel about governmental issues? How do you feel about whether or not we should be in certain wars? How do you feel about how much power the government does or does not have? Ultimately, all of those things and the way that you feel about them will place you somewhere on this line and will ultimately define you as a radical, a liberal, a moderate, a conservative, or a reactionary based on the opinions that you have. So let's kind of take a look at how that line is defined. So really, this line is kind of an example of the political spectrum line. It's simply a line that has a center and a left and a right. But there are a few ways in which we decide whether something is a left-leaning or right-leaning idea. So first, there's this concept of liberty, this concept of freedom. So ultimately, both sides believe in freedom, and both sides believe that people should have freedom, but the priorities that they place on the kinds of freedom that people should have are really what makes the distinction. So people that lean more to the left have a little bit more of a support of civil freedoms, so civil liberties. People on the left want freedom to be defined as people's ability to express themselves or behave however they want. On the left, they believe that people should be able to say whatever they want and express themselves however they want, but also sort of act however they want and be able to make the choices that they want. They believe that people, if they want to have the freedom to be able to use marijuana, well, that's a left-leaning idea because that's sort of a freedom of behavior issue. On the right, those folks tend to think of the idea of freedom and liberty as economic liberties. So people's ability to have the freedom to make and keep money. So a right-leaning idea would be, the free market, would be this idea of that companies and businesses should be able to make the choices that they need to and should have the freedom of choice to make as much money as they want, and the consumer should have the ability to choose whatever products, that they want to buy off of the shelves. Or, of course, the opposite of this is that if the left is looking at civil liberties and the left wants more civil liberties in the expression of behavior, the right disagrees with the civil liberty thing. The right feels that there should be a little bit less freedom of expression behavior and feel as though people should be a little bit more regulated in the kinds of things that they have the freedom to do. So this idea of regulating appropriate language or keeping porn off of television is more of a less civil liberties idea and therefore more of a right-wing idea. And back to the economic liberty thing, while the right, again, likes this idea of freedom to make and keep money, the right likes this idea, the left thinks that there should be a little bit more control of this, so there should be less freedom of this, that maybe the government should be in charge and to help make decisions to make sure that things are a little bit more equal. A little bit less freedom and a little bit more equal here. So, there's also the issue of equality and the way in which people on the left and people on the right think of this idea of equality. So folks on the left believe in equality of condition. People on the left think that things should be equal in the way that you live and everybody should have access to essentially equal stuff. That this idea of, wealth or poverty is sort of dumb and that everybody should have the ability to have kind of equal ability to be happy and survive and, all of those kinds of things. Whereas, of course, the right feels as though it's okay to not have equality of condition because that way certain people will work a little bit harder, to do a little bit better, and then it isn't, in their words, it isn't that people, that are struggling or in poverty, they don't have the ability to, just be given, free labor or be able to ride free, stuff. They won't have the ability to kind of ride on the backs of the other people that are doing really, really hard work. But also, there's this idea of equality of opportunity. And the right tends to support this idea of equality of opportunity, that everybody should have the opportunity to do the best that they can. And this goes along with this idea that competition brings out the best in people. So everybody should have the ability to work really hard and have the ability to try to earn the best things in life. Everybody should have the opportunity to do that. And again, this gets back to the idea that if you have awesome things in your life, it's because you earned them, and not just because they were given to you. Which, of course, folks on the left would rather that there be a little bit more support of the government in making sure that things are equal. So that sort of runs counter here. So you can see how they're a little bit different. So let's look at some of the categories here. So we're talking about a radical. So a radical is somebody that is on the very, very far left of the political spectrum. So they believe in this idea of the government controlling the economy. That, again, that when it comes to equality of condition, that the government should control the economy and make sure that everybody has equal opportunity, to have all of those things, and that everything is equalized so that everyone can kind of be on the same level economic playing field. And they may be willing to resort to fairly extreme things because, again, they're radical. They're very far left. They're very much on the far end, which makes them sort of intense left-wing folks. So they may be interested in, resorting to some fairly left-wing stuff. And so a pretty good example of this is Lenin, right? So like the mastermind of the Russian Revolution, kind of the person who first started allowing communism to happen, he would very much be a radical. Very into this government controlling the economy type stuff. Potentially into this idea of freedom of expression and freedom of those things, but not so much in his case, right? He's more into like government control of the economy to make sure that everything is super equal. And now let's look at what a liberal is. So a liberal is still on the left, right? But a little bit closer. They're not as far left, not as far left as a radical. They're a little bit less so, but still kind of on the left side. They still tend to believe in left side stuff. So these folks believe that the government should be involved in the promotion of social welfare of citizens. So they believe that the government should be involved in helping to make sure that things are equal for people economically, sort of like Lenin did, but less extremely. They feel that the government should have a role, but not necessarily that the government should just establish everything. These folks are usually into a little bit more gradual, peaceful type stuff, but also are pretty into this idea of freedom of expression, and the ability for people to express themselves and behave in ways that they want. And a really good example of a pretty classic liberal is Dr. Martin Luther King, of course. So, of course, he believed that the government should get involved in sort of helping to make sure that everybody has more of an equal playing field, that there can be a little bit more equality. Not as extreme as Lenin, of course, was more interested in peaceful type ways of getting his points across. Um, and so that kind of makes him a pretty good example of a liberal. So next, let's take a look at what a moderate is. So a moderate becomes a moderate generally because they share viewpoints with both liberals and conservatives. They'll generally have some positions that are sort of liberal. They feel sort of liberally on some things, but they also feel sort of conservatively about some things. So they're kind of in the middle. It doesn't really mean that they, don't have strong opinions. It generally means that they feel both ways depending on the issue. This also puts them in a position where they can be pretty tolerant of other people's views. They're pretty open to, listening to both sides. Moderates tend to be the folks that will listen to, both the Republican conventions and the Democratic conventions and decide what they want. They're less willing to just pick a side and just stick to their side no matter what. And of course, that sort of means that they don't hold especially extreme views either way. And a really good example of a moderate is our very own Mike Thompson. So he's our congressman, of course, and this guy is generally seen as a pretty good example of a moderate because he kind of has some left-leaning ideas and some right-leaning ideas. Because he deals with a lot of agricultural stuff in the valley, and so, but he also supports businesses, but he also has his own opinions on gun control type stuff. So he's generally considered fairly moderate. So next, we'll take a look at a conservative. So conservatives, by and large, are fairly into this idea of kind of keeping things the way they are. You'll generally hear, conservatives versus progressives. Progressives kind of is this term meaning to kind of move forward and change. So conservatives generally are not progressives. They generally want to stick to the classic way that things were or are. And that also means that they generally stick pretty closely to the Constitution. They generally believe that the Constitution is awesome and we shouldn't be going out of our way to change a bunch of things because things are fine the way that they were. As a result, they tend to be pretty cautious about adopting new stuff, especially if they involve activism of the government. They generally want to keep the government out of stuff and kind of allow people to have freedom of opportunity, like we mentioned before. They generally want people to have the freedom to be successful or not successful, depending on their own efforts, and not have the government overly involved in kind of deciding things in their lives. And they tend to believe pretty strongly in Thomas Jefferson's idea that the best government is the government that governs least. Conservatives generally want to keep the government out of stuff and to allow people to have the freedom of opportunity without government getting in the way of telling them how to live their lives. And so a really good example of a pretty middle ground conservative would be Senator Rick Santorum, who was running previously and generally was fairly calm about most of his stuff, but believed fairly conservatively on a lot of issues. Tended to stick pretty strongly to what most people would generally consider to be conservative viewpoints. So in pushing further right here, all the way on the edge of the right, we have reactionaries. So these folks are, not only do they want to just stick to kind of classic ideas, but they want to take things back to the good old days. They want to take things back to the way that things had previously been. They are also generally willing to use extreme methods to achieve their goals. They generally are in support of business, and freedom of, being able to make choices, and really not into freedom of expression. Really want to limit, people's ability to say things against the government. They really think that people need to be regulated to make sure they don't get out of hand and to make sure there's a certain amount of control of those sort of things, but plenty of freedom for business. And who's a good example of someone who would also have government make sure that they are controlling social and moral stuff? Well, our very old friend Adolf Hitler is a perfect example of a reactionary. Definitely willing to go to extreme methods. Definitely was interested in having a government that controlled social and moral stuff. Really not interested in having people, spend a lot of time protesting or, running counter to the government. And in general, a pretty good example of a reactionary on the far end over there. So this image here is a little bit does a fairly good job at showing how just the simple line idea is fairly limited, but also gives a little bit more data on what kinds of people fall into each of these things. So you can see that there's a category over here of government involvement, and of course people on the left want more, but people on the right want less, right? So liberals and left-wing people want more government involvement for equality, but conservatives and people on the right want less. They want people to have more freedom and less government. As far as change of government, how things change, people on the left want there to be change, right? They want there to be fast change or a little change or whatever. But on the right, they don't want change, or they want to return to the past. They want things to go back to kind of classic ways of existing. And here's some sort of like weird examples of people, that would fall in each of these areas. But then down here, it's cool because we get into some examples of issues. That on the left, the left-wing people, when you're talking about defense, they generally want to reduce government spending on the military, and they don't especially want the military to be especially active. They don't want, to get involved in other folks. But on the right, they generally want to increase spending on the military and spend more time involved in military stuff. On the left, of course, for the environment, they tend to want to spend more money, trying to save the environment, regulate stuff, get away from fossil fuels, keep the planet from warming. Whereas on the conservative side, they're a little bit more interested in using those resources in order to make sure that businesses have the freedom to do what they need to do, of course. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say for this part of the political spectrum. And there'll be a number of ways in which we continue to explore it. But for right now, hopefully this gives you an opportunity to feel like you're kind of getting your feet wet in this pretty big concept of the political spectrum.